plenty of things to discuss with this Phillies team with Keith Law as he joins us now on the Sports Bash Live on 97.3 ESPN. And Keith, I guess the Phillies, they made the move for Santana in the offseason. That had some people kind of saying, all right, they did something here. Maybe they're ready to make a little bit of a bigger move. But then they go out and get Jake Arrieta. What does this do for this Phillies team? Did you like the fit of Arrieta with the Phillies rotation?
Not really. And I don't want to say, I'm not saying in any sense that this is a bad move. I just don't feel like it's a great fit necessarily. Whereas with Santana, I could completely understand it. The team was not likely to put a lot of guys on base as it was. It's going to be an interesting young team to watch, and the lineup in particular, but Santana really brought something very specific that they were lacking. Now, you could also argue Arrieta gives them some starting pitching depth that they didn't have. He's carried some bulk innings the last few years, but I feel like he's pretty clearly declining. He was substantially worse last year than he was a couple of years before. And the 3-year deal probably doesn't do a lot to help them in their competitive window. This club is probably going to be just getting good either when he opts out or maybe at the end of the contract. And again, just given the trends we've seen from him, he's lost velocity, really struggled to throw a slider for strikes last year. He was kind of an average pitcher last season. An average pitcher helps the Phillies a little bit, but I don't know that he helps the Phillies $25 million a year. And I worry when a pitcher with his kind of workloads shows those signs of decline. Maybe that's a sign that it's just going to keep getting worse also. You don't want to be giving a pitcher a long-term deal when all the indicators seem to be pointing down.
Yeah, 3 years, 75. I mean, obviously he wanted more. The Phillies, on the surface, for 3 years, 75, is this kind of like, hey, we got what we wanted, you got what you wanted. Did somebody win the deal?
No, I don't think so. I don't think so because I think Arrieta, as you said, went into this market thinking he was going to get 5 or 6 years and probably thinking he was going to get a similar average salary to what he got here, probably thinking 25 a year, but getting a much longer contract. Now, I'm sure Arrieta and Scott Boras would say they came out well because they had the opt-out after 2 years, and the Phillies can restructure it to extend him an additional year to make it turn it into a 4-year deal. So there are some protections for Arrieta. Maybe if he throws well, if he goes back, if he has 2 good years, he can go back out onto the market in a stronger position, maybe in a different financial environment to what we saw this offseason. But I don't think it would be fair to say it was a win for him. And I don't think it's necessarily a win for the Phillies because it's a bet. It's essentially a bet that he's going to be better than he was last year. And if he's even as good as he was 2 years ago, then the Phillies are going to do just fine from a money perspective or even a trade value perspective. I don't think there's a chance Arrieta is going to get back to what he was 3 years ago. And he's kind of being paid more in that range as opposed to what he did last year.
Keith Law with us. Keith, you talked about Arrieta's numbers being down. Is there a number that stands out to you more than any other or more that gives you an indication that he's going to continue that slide? Is there something that jumps out at you that says this is the trend that he's going to continue sliding?
The fact that he has lost so much velocity, he's lost his average fastball has dropped. The average velocity in all his fastballs has dropped to about 2.5 miles an hour over 2 seasons. And I threw out there in my column, there's no way to tell. I don't think we're very good at predicting pitcher performance anyway. But what we saw with Tim Lincecum, who was all-world, won a couple of Cy Youngs, was a clear ace, one of the best pitchers in baseball for a couple of years. And all of a sudden, within a span of about 2 seasons, he went from that to someone who couldn't even stay in a major league rotation. Now, I'm not saying that's Arrieta at all. I don't want to make anyone think they should panic over this signing. But that is one possibility here when you see a pitcher who had some high workloads because he was so good and then loses velocity like that. And the 2 things that really wrecked his season last year were the drop in his fastball velocity and difficulty throwing his slider, which was so effective his Cy Young season. He couldn't throw it for strikes. It was actually the pitch really hurt him last year. And in particular, he had nothing to get lefties out because he couldn't run that slider. Sometimes it looks more like a cutter. He'd run that in on lefties' hands 3 years ago, and he'd be able to get ahead of them. He couldn't do that last year. And so I think that may actually be related to the fact that the fastball velocity was dropping, that this guy he's not hurt, but there's just wear and tear from pitching. And as a result, he's not the same guy he was in 2015.
Right. And you write in your column on ESPN.com that the drawbacks that Arrieta might be on a steeper decline than anybody realizes. But instead of just having all doom and gloom, you do say that he might bring some value in the fact that if they land a free agent prize next winter. And we talked about the fact that Arrieta played in Baltimore. There's this guy, Manny Machado. I mean, there could be value that's not even statistical related.
Well, I don't think that somebody asked me this too. Arrieta has the same agent as Bryce Harper, who's also going to be free agent. They're both Forest clients, and maybe that'll help them land Bryce Harper. Harper's going to go to whoever offers him the most money. Machado is going to go to whoever offers him the most money. Clayton Kershaw can opt out of his contract. My guess is he'll opt out and maybe go back to the Dodgers, but I think he'll try to test the market. Those guys are going to whoever offers them the most. I do think, though, the potential silver lining is Phillies have plenty of money to outbid everybody else on any of those players. If they do something like that after next offseason and another one or two of their good prospects gets to the big leagues this year and they still have the prospect depth to make another trade, Klentak and his group could really retool this club very quickly in the 2018-2019 offseason. Use this year to continue to develop. Hopefully you get a good, healthy season out of Arrieta. You go into next offseason, target one of the big free agents, try to swing a trade with some of that prospect depth, especially some of that Latin American pitching depth they have. This could be a very good, very interesting, and still fairly young club in 2019 that we really could talk about as a division contender. It's tough for me to say that now because Arrieta would be the first piece in a long-term plan, and we just don't know if they're going to be able to execute that or if that is even their plan for the 2019 season.
Keith Law is with us, ESPN.com. Check out his insider piece on the 3-year deal the Phillies gave to Jake Arrieta. Overall, we've talked a lot over the years about where this team kind of fell off from where they were. Do you like the way where they are right now? Do you like the pace that they are on and where they are as a franchise and an organization?
Oh, very much. Very, very much. I think they're in excellent shape. I think that the patience that they have shown with some of their younger players and especially with their Latin American program, which might be the most productive in baseball. When you look at what they've spent to sign some of these Latin American prospects, and I'm referring to the Dominican, Venezuelan players who tend to sign in their age 16 season, not guys taken out of the draft, just it's a different department. Their international program might be the best in the game. They've found a lot of prospects for fairly low bonuses. A lot of other clubs that have good Latin American pipelines like the Padres, they've done it with money. The Phillies have actually found a lot of bargains in that market, and it has really provided a ton of depth and even high-end depth in their farm system. They need to be a little more productive in the draft. I think that's the one thing that has not happened for them so far, not since Klentak and his group took over. If they draft well, they have another high pick again this year. They draft well this season, then this June, that's really going to continue to accelerate this rebuild. They could be very good in 19, definitely in 20, because there's so much prospect depth. And most of what we're talking about now, these are guys in A-ball. By the time we get to the middle of 2019, those guys are going to be knocking on the door, even getting to the big league.
Well, and they're finally putting out a major league product that is featuring some of these younger players that you and I have been talking about over the years. We're finally going to get to see them, so that kind of gives you at least the ability to start to evaluate these guys against big league players.
Yes, and I think it's important that they do that. Use the word evaluate is key here, too, because I think J.P. Crawford's going to be a great player. We've talked about him forever. He looked really good in September. But they have a lot of guys who have question marks. Nick Williams, Michael Franco, who's really kind of been a disappointment so far. They are in a season this year where there's no expectations. They're not really directly trying to contend. They're not tanking, obviously, but there's no thought that they're going to go out and win the division. Play these guys. Give as many of these guys as you can full seasons, or as much of a full season as you can against major league pitching, and see if they continue to make progress. If Michael Franco doesn't make progress this year, fine. You've really given him enough of a chance. You probably know what he is, and you turn the page and look for someone else. If Nick Williams cannot improve his plate discipline, if Jorge Alfaro, who I hear looks very good in spring training, if he doesn't really improve his receiving, then maybe he's not your long-term catching option. But you've got to play all these guys to find out, because most of these guys have had success all the way up through AAA. There's no point in sending them down or keeping these guys in AAA. And that's going to be true of Scott Kingery at some point this year. If he's going to start the year at AAA, and he's probably going to rake like he did last year, they're going to have to call him up at some point and find a way for him to play so that they can evaluate him against big league pitching and decide if he is, as I think he is, they're a long-term answer at second.
And what's the what is that rule? So how many games do you think? How many games did Bryant sit out? Do you think this Phillies do something similar to what the Cubs did a couple of years ago?
Well, Kingery's situation is different just because he's kind of blocked. Cesar Hernandez is a good player, and they don't want to just. Obviously, they're not going to bench him, and they don't want to just give him away. I know that they have at least listened to what the market might give them in trade, but the trade market has not been that much better than the free agent market this offseason. I have a feeling they'll get into the June-July timeframe and then at that point explore trade options for Hernandez because he could help quite a few contenders, and then just bring Kingery up and install him as the second baseman. And he can field. He's an outstanding defender at second. He can really run. He's now come into some power. You got a chance for an all-star there. And my guess is by the time he comes up, he'll have had so much AAA experience, he'll be able to contribute right away.
Keith Law with us here on the Sports Bash. The Phillies signing Jake Arrieta. I guess he'll fit behind Nola. So you got Nola and Arrieta at the top of that rotation. At least it's better than what they had, because that was one thing. The people like this team, Keith, but the pitching, it was almost like you were doing a disservice by going in with the pitching that you had.
Right. And Arrieta, as long as Arrieta is healthy, and he wasn't hurt last year, he just wasn't as good, but he was healthy. As long as he can make 30 starts for them this year, he's going to be better than whoever he bumped from their rotation. Whoever you say was their fifth starter, they didn't really settle on one, but those guys all had kind of similar projections. He pushes everyone back a slot. One guy gets bumped from the rotation. He's better than whoever that was. As long as he's healthy enough to make 30 starts, give you 170 or so innings, that's an upgrade. Obviously, they're hoping that they get a little bit more, but I think there's also the thinking, too, is, okay, now we can maybe have one of our fifth starter candidates starts the year in the bullpen, starts the year in the AAA rotation. We get some more time to work through these different options because they have a lot of pitchers, too, who are potentially back-end starters, but I don't think any of those guys have really separated themselves and earned long-term rotation spots, so it becomes an ongoing trial. Well, all these guys get 10, 12 starts, and when somebody isn't effective, when Vince Velasquez gets hurt again, all right, now we call up the next guy.
Correct.
It gives you more flexibility if the first two spots are locked down.
At Keith Law on Twitter. He is out in Arizona following the Cactus League, but it's kind enough to talk a little Grapefruit League, as he writes over at ESPN.com about the Phillies' acquisition of Jake Arrieta. Keith, always a pleasure, pal.
Yep, my pleasure.